Hello everyone, welcome to my update US gossip channel. At long last, after years of whispered suspicions, escalating tension, and carefully concealed resentment behind the closed doors of the sprawling Flagstaff home, the final breaking point came crashing down like a storm no one, not even Kody Brown with all his bravado and self-proclaimed spiritual leadership, could have predicted, because Robyn Brown, the wife who had spent years cultivating an image of doe-eyed innocence and martyr-like devotion to her husband, executed a masterstroke of manipulation so quietly, so meticulously, and so devastatingly that even her harshest critics in the fandom couldn't deny the sheer theatrical brilliance of it. She embezzled all the remaining Brown family property, siphoned assets out of the Coyote Pass accounts, shifted deeds, redirected funds, and, with a calmness that bordered on eerie, waited for the perfect moment to strike. And that moment arrived on a bitterly cold morning when Kody, hair tousled and chest puffed in his usual attempt to reclaim authority, stormed into the kitchen demanding answers about missing funds, only to find Robyn sitting at the table already surrounded by a fortress of legal documents bearing her name, her signature, and the unmistakable stamp of completed transfers that placed every last parcel, account, and financial tie under her exclusive ownership. And before Kody could summon even a sliver of indignation or unleash one of his trademark tirades about loyalty, unity, betrayal, or the sacred structure of plural marriage, Robyn rose from her chair with glacial calm, set her coffee mug down, and in a voice so still and sharp it froze the air between them, said, "I told you I'd protect my children, I just didn't tell you what I'd protect them from." And for the first time in decades, a period Kody had long ruled with emotional whiplash, charismatic manipulation, favoritism disguised as spiritual preference, and guilt masked as divine instruction, he found himself utterly speechless. Because the realization washed over him in a slow, mortifying wave. She hadn't just taken the money, she hadn't just taken the land, she hadn't just taken power, she had taken control of his entire legacy, the very empire he had sacrificed his relationships with Mary, Christine, and Janelle for, the dream he had weaponized to keep the family orbiting around him, and now that dream belonged to Robyn alone. And as he sputtered, stammered, and flipped through papers in disbelief, his voice rising an octave each time he saw her name where his should have been, Robyn simply walked to the door, pulled out a single suitcase he hadn't even noticed sitting beside it, and placed it in front of him with an almost ceremonial finality, telling him that his presence was no longer welcome in the house, that his chaos and volatility had exhausted whatever loyalty she'd once tried to maintain, and that she had spent the last 2 years quietly preparing for this because after the other wives had left, after his children had distanced themselves, after the show's narrative had shifted from plural love to public implosion, something inside her had hardened, cracked, and finally reorganized itself into a resolve so strong that even Kody's flare-ups, tantrums, and frantic promises to fix everything couldn't penetrate it, and Kody, now trembling with a mix of fury and desperation, tried to invoke everything he had ever used to control the family: God, covenant, unity, sacrifice, patriarchy, the principle, their shared history. But Robyn shut him down with a single raised hand and explained that she had kept detailed records of every instance of financial mismanagement, every deceptive transfer he'd initiated, every time he'd prioritized one wife's property dream over another's mortgage crisis, every moment he'd chosen ego over partnership. And with those records she had built an airtight case to protect herself legally, because she knew that when the empire fell, she'd be blamed unless she seized control. And while she acknowledged that the world would probably still vilify her, she no longer cared, because survival mattered more than perception, and her children mattered more than his pride. And the shock on Kody's face deepened into something akin to emotional collapse as he realized he wasn't leaving on his own terms, he wasn't moving back to an RV, he wasn't choosing to recenter himself, he wasn't embarking on some new spiritual journey. No, he was being evicted. Banished, exiled from the home he thought would be his last stronghold, and Robyn, whose tears had always seemed to come so easily in past seasons, didn't shed a single drop as she opened the door, letting in a blast of cold air that rustled the papers still shaking in his hands, and she told him the Uber was already waiting to take him wherever he needed to go, because yes, she had even planned his exit transportation. And as he stepped outside in stunned silence, suitcase wheels dragging unevenly over the walkway he once envisioned leading to a grand communal home for dozens of descendants, Robyn closed the door slowly, so slowly it felt like the symbolic sealing of an era, and leaned her back against it, releasing the first genuine exhale she'd taken in years, and somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the armor she had built after enduring years of blame for every fracture in the family, she felt something that was not triumph, not joy, not victory, but relief, because she had finally severed herself from the cycle of dysfunction that had consumed all of them, and she knew the world would explode with theories, accusations, and think pieces about her true motives, but none of it mattered now, because the property was hers, the accounts were secure, the house was peaceful, and the man who had once strutted through that home proclaiming himself the head of a celestial family was now standing on the curb with nowhere to go, leaving Robyn to walk back into the kitchen, pick up her now lukewarm coffee, and start drafting the statement she knew she'd eventually have to release to the public, one that would no doubt ignite controversy but would also mark the beginning of her new chapter, one in which she was no longer the villain in someone else's story, no longer the scapegoat of a collapsing plural marriage, no longer the desperate wife clinging to a fantasy of unity, but a woman who took back her power in the most dramatic, explosive, and unforgettable way possible, and somewhere across the country, the other wives would eventually hear the news, each reacting in their own ways, Christine with bewildered laughter, Janelle with a knowing sigh, Mary with a complicated blend of vindication and melancholy, and together, in separate states, they would come to the same realization: the Brown family era had officially ended, not with a reconciliation, not with healing, but with Robyn delivering the final plot twist no one saw coming, the kind of twist that would echo through reality TV history and leave fans debating for years whether she had been the master manipulator or the unexpected heroine of this entire saga. But the story did not end with Robyn shutting the door and reclaiming a semblance of peace. In fact, the aftermath ignited an even greater storm across the sister wives universe, because once Kody stood outside with his suitcase and broken pride, he didn't simply disappear into the cold Flagstaff air, he hovered, pacing in disbelief, replaying every moment of the confrontation like an obsessive loop he couldn't escape, and the more he replayed it, the more his shock mutated into a delusional determination to regain control, convincing himself that Robyn's meticulous legal maneuvers couldn't possibly be airtight, that she must have made a mistake somewhere, and that he, the patriarch, the architect of their once grand plural lifestyle, would find it. He imagined marching into court, imagined dramatic face-offs, imagined persuading a judge with the same grand speeches he once used to persuade his wives. But what he didn't know was that Robyn had anticipated this exact reaction and had already hired attorneys skilled enough to dismantle any attempt Kody might make to challenge her, attorneys who viewed the case not as a domestic dispute but as a full-scale reclamation of assets from a man known for erratic financial decisions. And while Kody frantically called everyone he could, producers, old friends, estranged children, even Mary who hadn't taken his calls in months, his pleas landed on voicemail after voicemail, because by now nearly everyone had learned to shield themselves from the whirlwind of crisis that followed him like a shadow, leaving him with the crushing realization that he had alienated every support system he once thought was guaranteed. And meanwhile inside the house, Robyn wasn't celebrating or plotting further moves. She was sitting at the dining table in absolute stillness, processing the emotional weight of what she had just done, feeling the tremor of adrenaline weakening into a deep fatigue, but also acknowledging the unmistakable sense of liberation rising within her, because she knew this wasn't just about property or survival. This was about breaking free from a marriage where she'd spent years cushioning Kody's ego, cleaning up his relational messes, absorbing the wrath of the public, and being cast as the villain every time the family fractured. And now that she had taken decisive action, she found herself wondering what life might look like without crisis dictating her every move, without cameras waiting to capture her tears, without walking on eggshells around a man whose moods could switch from tenderness to fury in seconds. She imagined simpler mornings, calm evenings with her children, even a return to hobbies and passions she'd buried under the weight of keeping the family together. And as she contemplated the future, Kody, still outside and refusing to leave, began pacing more aggressively, muttering under his breath about betrayal and spiritual treason, until finally frustration consumed him and he began pounding on the door, shouting Robyn's name with an urgency that echoed through the quiet neighborhood, prompting a few distant lights in nearby houses to flicker on. But Robyn remained unmoving because she had already decided that this chapter was closed, and after several minutes of unanswered pounding, Kody's shouts faded into exhausted silence, the cold settling deep into his bones as he sank onto the curb beside his suitcase, and he sat there long enough for the Uber driver who had been waiting patiently to finally roll down his window and say, "Sir, are you riding or not?" A question that sliced through the last remnants of Kody's denial, forcing him to confront the reality he'd been resisting. He truly no longer lived here. He had been removed, expelled, dismissed in a way no spiritual justification or patriarchal rhetoric could undo, and with shaking hands he finally stood, loaded his suitcase into the car, and took one last, gut-wrenching look at the house that had once symbolized his new beginning with Robyn but now served as the stage for his ultimate downfall. And as the car pulled away, Robyn watched from behind the blinds, not out of regret or guilt, but to ensure he had truly left, because she knew Kody's patterns well enough to understand that closure wouldn't come easily for him. And in the days that followed, the shockwave of the split rattled not just the family but the entire Sister Wives fandom, sparking online debates, theories, sympathy wars, and accusatory think pieces dissecting every frame of the show from the last 14 years in search of hints that this bombshell ending had been in the making. And while the internet exploded with speculation, the other wives reacted in characteristically unique ways. Christine, now living her happiest chapter with David, laughed in a way that almost startled him, shaking her head and saying, "Well, that was bound to blow up eventually," while Janelle received the news with a quiet, contemplative nod, recognizing that Robyn's bold move was simply the final domino in a chain reaction that had started long before Flagstaff. And Mary, hearing the news through a friend rather than from Kody, felt an unexpected mix of vindication and sorrow, remembering all the years she'd spent trying to repair a marriage he let die, and now seeing him suffer the consequences she had once begged him to avoid. And as each of them processed this new reality, one unspoken truth settled over all of them like a soft but undeniable blanket. Kody Brown, the man who had once juggled 4 marriages, 18 children, and a multi-property empire, now stood alone without a house, without a wife, without a plan, left to rebuild a life he had watched crumble in slow motion, while Robyn, for the first time in years, walked through her house with a steady breath, feeling not victorious, not triumphant, but finally, undeniably, free.